The Tower.
Steve McQueen, Paul Newman, William Holden, Faye Dunaway, The Towering Inferno.
When it comes to this card, I actually don't think most new readers have a hard time understanding it. I think it's pretty clear what we're seeing. But I think a lot of us, when we're learning, have a hard time contextualizing it in certain life situations, particularly when we're reading about something kind of banal. And that's what I want to talk about today. I don't think that necessarily common associations with the card are bad or wrong. Well, I don't think any associations with the card are bad or wrong, or any of the cards are bad or wrong. But I think, what we see is what we get in some ways with this card, and that makes sense. The way that I learned it is that it sort of represented the total collapse of major systems or institutions, this sort of like world level stuff we're seeing in the news today, for sure. And yeah, those moments happen. We're seeing it in the news every day. And, companies fold and collapse, norms get busted, the world changes completely. But like, in my experience, after, over 20 years of doing this, most tarot readings aren't about stuff that big. They can be. But most readings, when people come to see us, if we're reading for others, or even if we're reading for ourselves, tend to be a little bit more banal than that. Because even though there are these major events sort of swirling around us at all times, we are, in a way, sort of the center of our universes. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, we can only kind of comprehend what is comprehensible to us. And a lot of what's going on in the world around us a lot of the time is not comprehensible. What we want to know, sort of, is like, does he like me? And there's nothing wrong with that either. If most tarot readings were about these like major life events, if everything were about like the world collapsing, I don't think I would have the energy to do it, as a reader. I don't think anyone would. You know what I mean? It takes a lot out of you. Anyone who's got a tendency like me to doom scroll knows how fucking exhausting that is. And so if we were always reading about these massive things, it would just wear us out. I talk in my classes and also in your Tarot Toolkit a bit about predicting what's predictable. And I guess what I mean by that is like the pandemic. I remember doing a reading for someone 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago now, and this was a Sibylla reading, not a tarot reading, but I think the thing is still the same. I saw a moment around March of 2020 where I saw sickness. And again, Sibylla has a card that represents that. But I said, I would just check in with your doctor around this time, like something's going to derail. It was a reading about their job. Something's going to derail. Just be aware. Now, in retrospect, that could have been the pandemic, but I had no way of knowing that was even a conceivable thing, even though at that time the headlines were starting to ratchet up. This would have been January of that year. And all of the pieces were in place for the thing that happened to happen. It was just incomprehensible to me. And I could not have imagined, nor would I have even been brave enough to say, oh, your job search will be derailed by a global pandemic. Like, that's just not something I feel like is predictable in the realm of a tarot reading under most circumstances, because we can only imagine what's imaginable, I guess, if that makes sense. The problem with our ability to predict disaster or anything sort of massive like that is that it relies on our ability to imagine something that we can't have imagined yet, that we haven't experienced yet. Maybe some people can. I certainly can't. I don't have that Nostradamus quality about it. I have a video on this, and it's also a big part of your Tarot Toolkit, which is this idea of size and scope. And I think for a lot of readers who need to understand the Tower in day-to-day experiences, size and scope can be really, really powerful. By size, we mean sort of the objective bigness of the question. Should I quit my job and go move to a communal ashram? What is my mission in life? Those are like big, spiritual, large, life-changing questions. What can I do to make this project more successful is a much smaller question. Even if in the moment it feels like a big thing that you're never going to accomplish. Like, objectively, the size of that question is much smaller than should I quit my job and change everything about my life and go live in a communal, commune. So, like, the size of the question is something that I, as a reader, try to wrestle with internally if I'm reading for someone else. It's not something I really discuss with a client or a querent. But when I am reading for myself, then it is a question I'll ask myself. Like, how big is this really? If I were standing outside of this, how large would this question be? The reason that it's important is it helps us understand how all of the majors, but this card in particular, is going to function. Yes, it could represent the collapse of an entire company, but it might just mean a bad meeting. The other part of that is scope. And scope is sort of what's reasonably interpretive based on what we know about the question and the card. You know what I mean? So again, I said like the tower could represent a company collapsing, but if it's not reasonably in scope for a question, then that's not an interpretation that makes sense. You know what I mean? If the tower represents like the crushing of institutions or historical, processes or whatever, and the question is like, where should we go on vacation? Then the scope of total collapse doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? And so the size and the scope of the interpretation has to match the size and the scope of the answer. And when we're talking about the tower, we're really sort of taking those metaphors that all of us have learned about the tower and sort of shrinking or expanding them to meet the size and scope of the question. And this really goes for all of tarot, but I think that the tower is a great way to kind of summarize the way that size and scope matter in a reading. That was a thing that I didn't understand as a new reader, and I think a lot of new readers struggle with it, is the idea that we learn sort of the major arcana and we do get these massive, sort of huge emotional archetypes, these huge spiritual life-changing archetypes, and they represent sort of the bigness, the major arcana, right? But like in a reading where it's how can I make this project less stressful, we get stuck, we get stumped. And that's where size and scope really matter. And so how do I make this project less stressful in the context of the tower doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to get fired or you should quit your job and move to France. It means that maybe you need to sort of start from scratch, like shake it all up, just blow up the whole thing, start from the beginning and say, okay, what did we miss? In corporate speak, we call that like a pre-mortem, where we sort of say, okay, what is all the things that could go wrong that we didn't think about? Let's think about that now and then restructure our project plan. So in that case, the tower becomes not about like the destruction of moral systems or historical systems. It just becomes about like, okay, let's just blow this up and see how we can look at it fresh. And that is an appropriate size and scope for the tower, given that question. Now, I should add that there are readers who feel like you will never see the tower unless it does have a massive size and scope, so that the tower always represents something major collapsing. That's valid. In 20 years of reading, I have not found that to be true because, again, most readings tend not to be that consequential. Even the ones that seem important at the time, in retrospect, we go, oh yeah, like I kind of knew that, and I was kind of avoiding it, and the reading kind of told me what I didn't want to hear. You know what I mean? And oftentimes the tower has that quality to it. We're kind of like holding back something we know was going to happen, and we're like, but, and the world is like, no, it's going to happen. When I see the tower in readings, sometimes it can mean massive shakeups. The tower with the Hierophant could absolutely suggest real bad news for conservative mores and norms. You know what I mean? Because the tower is taking that conservative Hierophant and sort of blasting it to shreds. I will say, too, that there is a massive sexual energy in the tower because it does sort of represent orgasms or release just in the sort of image of it. You know what I mean? Obviously, it's a very sort of male-centric image, but that doesn't need to mean that the card sort of represents just that. It has an explosive quality to it, that I think is very sexual. And so with sexy cards like the Devil, with the Eight of Wands, with the Knights, there could be that quality of sexual energy for sure. The Empress, the Lovers, If there's a card that represents sort of explosive orgasm, it's that one, and with fiery cards, with emotional cards, that makes total sense. My friend Justin Michael, who has a channel on YouTube, if you haven't checked it out, you should. He does a lot of videos about historical tarot, which are really interesting. But he does a video, and I can't remember the name of it. Maybe he'll see this and post it in the comments, where he talks about how there's some there's some thought that the tower is actually not the important part of the image, that the important part of the image is actually the lightning bolt. So he talks about in this video how what was really a sequence, the lightning, the star, the moon, and the sun, were these series of lights. So this sort of like earthly light, this bolt of light and the lightning, then the star, then the moon, and then the sun. And so in that case, the lightning could come to the fore and become kind of the star of the show. And in that case, it could represent weather. It could certainly represent storms. If you are doing a reading like should we evacuate before the hurricane, the tower, I would say, would mean absolutely get out. It represents electricity. So anything technological that relies on electricity could be shown here, and also light bulb moments, those sort of electrical moments of like aha, so electricity, light bulbs, technology, certainly currents, with lightning as a current. All of these things you can find in that reading too. And so if you need to sort of like shock something into being, it's alive, the tower might be like, you gotta just like jab it, just like give it that shock, give it a little EKG. And so in that case, again, it becomes less about the destructive nature of the tower and more of the, like, the pow, I'm very, like, onomatopoetic today. Pow, bam, boom. Is that a thing? And it becomes about sort of a moment of creation or like a bolt of something happening, a shock, an awe, those sort of moments in life. And, if you pair it with cards that do have like creative energy to it, like in the Empress video, we talked about how there is some sort of creative energy to the Empress, then the Empress in the Tower could suggest like like an explosively fertile moment. And so I think that's a really cool way, contextually in some instances, to read the Tower too. It's the only card in the deck that actually kind of features a building as its central icon, and so in that case it really could represent a building of any kind. And I will say that the Tower and the Star, as a tarot reader, my interpretations of them in day-to-day life have been really influenced by Common Lenormand interpretations of those two cards, even though they're not the same thing and they're not related. But I think in certain situations the Tower itself could just represent the building. And then of course in the French tradition, the name of the Tower is La Maison Dieu, the House of God. So it could represent churches or any sort of spiritual building or institution, not necessarily a Christian one. You know what I mean? It could be a summit, it could be a Mason Hall, a coven, anywhere where spiritual work gets done. The Tower could represent that. And even though the sort of Pamela Coleman Smith image is so sort of dark and violent, in moments of ecstasy, in the communion between the divine and human, it can feel that way. It can feel that explosive and big, and so again, there can be divine ecstasy in the institution. There can be divine ecstasy in the situation that you get with that card, which is big, which is huge, which is life-changing, but isn't necessarily an entirely destructive force. Or if it's destructive in a good way. It's sort of clearing the way for something new, for an enlightenment moment, and I think that light, the lightning, makes it really powerful and really cool, even if we are sort of getting beyond the kinds of things I tend to read about, which are much smaller, more day-to-day, more banal. I mean, hey, after the last couple years, I have seen this card represent various levels of meltdowns, because God knows I've had my share of them. But it can also just be sort of a moment of cleansing. There's that ionic electric smell when lightning hits something, and ions really clear the air. There's a reason why a lot of air purifiers have ionic sensors in there, or ionic buzzer maker thingies. I'm not going to even pretend to know what I'm talking about here. They have ionic things in them, and that clears the air. So that feeling of freshness after a storm and that sort of acrid electrical smell makes me think of that card too. It's a very sort of clean, bracing, even antiseptic quality that sometimes we really need, especially after a pandemic, you know what I mean? I have seen this card represent times in life, and I started to allude to this earlier, but I knew I was going to talk about it here. There are times in life where it's been time for a change for a while, and we know it, and we're avoiding it because we're scared, we're afraid we can't do it, we're afraid we're going to lose something we care about or that we've been clinging to. And sometimes life makes the change for us, whether we want it to or not. Sometimes life does the thing because we are not willing to. And I think that you can see in this card as well. There are some changes that are inevitable whether or not we want them to happen. And if we don't sort of embrace the change and take charge of it, it's going to happen anyway, and we're going to get sort of rolled over by it. Whereas if we lean into it and say, okay, this is going to happen, so let me become part of it rather than be steamrolled by it. And I think in an advice reading, the card can suggest that too. Like, look, change is coming. You can get on the train or you can get under it, but it's happening. So get on the train. I'm pretty picky about how this card is designed, and I'm sure it'll be shocking to you that I kind of prefer the pre-Golden Dawn Marseille, which is much more neutral, but I find Pamela Coleman Smith's image of this so iconic. I remember so viscerally seeing it for the first time. So I don't mind that, but what I really mind is when actual life events, actual historical events are depicted on that card. That I find really upsetting, and I think it's very limiting, because the moment can never be anything other than what it was. So like the Urban Tarot for its early editions had the September 11th terrorist bombings in the United States. There's no way to read that neutrally. And I don't even want to pick up a deck with that in it, because it can never be anything other than what it was. And it's hard to sort of make that into a metaphor for relationship experience. So I sort of don't want to see like that, but I also don't want to see like the USS Arizona or the Hiroshima bombs. You know what I mean? Like those are so fundamentally fucked up that like to put it on a tarot card is just, I guess to me, kind of fundamentally fucked up. And like I get the reason why, but I just don't like it, and I don't want it in a deck, you know what I mean? So I guess if you're a deck designer, just keep that in mind. Like there's this beautiful deck someone showed me that was like the Titanic, but like the Titanic as a tower deck to me is like, it's like, no, you wouldn't make a Hindenburg deck. You know what I mean? Like it just doesn't make sense to me. But the point of all of this isn't so much that like the tradition. I don't really sort of have a revolutionary approach to this card necessarily. Like it is sort of a blast. It's a lightning strike. It's a shake up. It's an event. It's a pow. More onomatopoeia, more onomatopoeia Batman. But size and scope is really the point here. So when it comes to the question, you want to think about how big it is objectively, and then what sort of interpretations you have for the card that are reasonable given that question. The example I use in the book is, you're going into a meeting to plan the holiday party at work, and you get the Tower card. Does that mean that the company is going to close and fold and everyone's going to lose their jobs during that meeting? I mean, it could, but probably not. What's more likely is that someone has a tantrum. You know what I mean? Like, and walks out of the meeting, or that you need to find a new venue and start from scratch. Like, that is a more size and scope appropriate answer for that kind of question. And so for the Tower, it's really just about how do I make it make sense realistically, given the potential outcomes for this in a reasonable situation, if that makes any sense. So, we're like nearing the finish line. This is crazy. Oh my God. What's going to happen when this is over? I don't know. What are we going to do? But that's the Tower. So where do you see the Tower in real life? How do you see it in the day-to-day existence, things that are small, that aren't about sort of blowing up entire systems? And how do you separate the fact that we are seeing actual massive global Tower moments happening kind of every day from the fact that in a reading, people just want to know kind of like what they should make for dinner, or if they should like hook up with that guy? You know what I mean? Like, how do you separate those two? Thanks again for watching. As always, I hope this is helpful. Take care, be good. We'll see you next week for the Star, and we'll talk soon.